Okay, I think we can get started though. Erev Tov, everybody. A pleasure to welcome everybody. Hope everybody's doing as well as can be. And it's a pleasure to welcome Sofia Freudenstein, who I think I've known for half your life. Is that a fair statement?
At least, maybe.
At least half your life. So we go back to our days in chat when Sophia was really the lone woman who would come to Minyan in the morning. I must say, Sophia, I don't know if you know, these days we get 6 to 10 women every morning coming to Minyan at chat. So you started a trend, but anyways, Baruch Hashem. But she is now currently, Sophia is now currently a student at Yeshivat Maharat and a master's student in the Bernard Revel Graduate School in philosophy. Graduated with honors bachelor degrees from University of Toronto with a double major in Jewish studies and philosophy. She served as the co-Rosh Beit Midrash at Camp Stone for 2 summers and worked at the Drisha, the Drisha High School program as a student of Midrash at Lindenbaum, and it's a pleasure to welcome her. She's now studying Maharat and Yeshivat Drisha. Hopefully she'll be going back to Israel in the near future, but we'll see how that works out, please God. And Sophia, Vakasha, it's all yours.
Amazing. Thank you, Rabbi Jay, for the introduction. It is definitely an honor to be here on Zoom with you this evening, because I've known Rabbi Jay for so long, and also because I think Torah in Motion is putting out fantastic content, especially in the Zoom world, for so many people to have access to it. So it's a real honor to be here. And it's also a real honor for me to get to speak to you tonight about Parshat Toldot. I believe the sources were posted in the chat. I will also share my screen so that you can see the sources. I condensed some of them as well, that you'll see on the slides that I have. I believe the usual format of the Parsha Shir for Torah in Motion is that there isn't so much active, loud participation from people who are viewing during. But if you have thoughts or questions or clarification points, if you want to put them in the chat, I'd be happy to see them. I don't really like hearing the sound of my voice for a long time. And I think that's the best way to do engagement. So I guess that's the one caveat I'd have before we start. Okay. All right. Hopefully people can see my screen. Okay. I don't hear any active complaints otherwise. All right. So Parshat Toldot. There's lots to talk about in this week's Parsha. We are in Sefer Bereshit. We are learning about where we came from, our family history, and we are moving on to the stories of Yaakov and Esav, into the third patriarch. And what stood out to me this year in particular when reading the text is actually Esav. There's lots to be said. There's lots of action throughout this parsha. There's the story of the selling of the birthright. There's the trickery of Yitzchak. Lots of other things in between. But to me, what stood out the most was Esav and Esav's reaction to what's going on. So I wanted to start us off in that, and in particular, I think because we learn these stories in day school or as young children in very simplified forms, and there's usually a clear good guy and a clear bad guy. And what I want to do today is kind of blur that a little bit, and hopefully not just blur it for the sake of blurring it, but maybe for us to think differently about what the role of our forefathers should be and what kind of lessons we can learn from their past. So okay, so we're going to start off here in the middle of this story. This is after Yaakov has tricked Yitzchak into thinking that he is Esav to receive the blessing that Esav was supposed to get. And we're going to be looking at Esav's very human reaction in response to it. So it says, Vayomer, talking about Esav. Hachi kara shemo Yaakov, vayagveni zeh pa'amayim et bechorati lakach, v'hinei ata lakach birchati. Vaomar halo atzalta li bracha. So what Esav is doing here is a little bit of wordplay with Yaakov's name. He's saying, well, it's within Yaakov's name that he should supplant or grab hold of me, because he has now done that to me or tricked me in these 2 ways. One is that he took my birthright, and the second is that he took my blessing, which is also like a fun literary thing going on here, because we see that the root for bechora is bet chaf resh, and then for bracha, for blessing, is bet resh chaf. So we're switching up the lettering a little bit, but you can imagine it almost sounds poetic in the way that Esav is saying it, which is kind of driving his point home that Yaakov has tricked him not only once but twice. Okay. Vayan Yitzchak vayomer le'esav, hein gvir samtiv lach, ve'et kol achav natati lo lavadim, v'dagan v'tirosh semachti v'lecha efo ma'aseh b'ni. So not the most comforting of parental answers, but Yitzchak is like, yeah, I I gave away a lot of this stuff to Yaakov in this blessing. I gave him slaves, I gave him all this produce. And what am I supposed to do for you now, Esav? Like, I already gave away the blessing that was designated for you. I gave it to Yaakov. Vayomer Esav el Aviv, Havracha achat hi lecha avi, barcheni gam ani avi, vayisa Esav kolo vayefk. And so Esav says to his father, okay, I didn't even get a blessing. Please bless me as well. And then Esav cries. And so usually the way that that Esav is, I think, talked about within our general Jewish framework is that we look down on him. He's someone who's impulsive. He is even evil if we're going to be seeing him as the progenitor of Rome or of Christianity, and how the polemics within Chazal are dealing with the role of Esav. But to me, when I read the pshat here, I just have a very human reaction, which is that Esav was supposed to get something. He didn't, and now he's very sad. And we could think, oh, maybe this is my own modern I don't know, my own modern disposition reading this in, but I do have a midrash here for you also to show that maybe there's something to be said about empathizing with Esav here. This is from Breshit Rabbah. And what they're doing here is they're comparing the wailing and sadness of Esav to the wailing and sadness of our own people. So what it says, Kishma Esav et divrei aviv, this is referring to when Esav hears that Yitzchak has now given the blessing to Yaakov instead of him. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Kol mishehu omer shakadosh baruch hu vatranhu vitvartun b'nei meohi ela marich apei v'gabei delay. So what we're saying here is that Rabbi Chanina is saying, anyone who says that God, it's like a funny way to say it, that he is lax, his intestines should be lax. But basically what we're saying here is that when God sees that there's injustice, God will act. And he'll make sure that in the long run, the people who need justice will get justice. Okay, so what is the example here? Za'aka achat, hizik Yaakov le'esav, that Jacob caused Esav to cry out loud. Dichtiv kishma Esav et divrei aviv vayizak za'aka. When Esav heard that the blessing had happened without him, he had let out this huge cry. Ve'chan nifralo, and where in the long run did Yaakov get punished for doing that? B'shushan habira, shene'emar vayizak za'aka gdola umara ad me'od. So where do we see that Yaakov, or more so his descendants, are going to be the ones who also now are going to be wailing in a midah k'neged midah, measure for measure kind of fashion, all the way to the story of Esther hundreds of years later, that in response to hearing about Haman and the decrees that he had, that then the Jewish people in Shushan cried. So it seems like a huge amount of time between Esav's crying and then the people during Esther's time crying. But the idea is that even though you might have thought at first God was not going to give justice to Jacob and his descendants, in the long run, God does give justice. And I think for us, that's supposed to invoke some kind of empathy, because we can understand why the people in Shushan are crying. We hear that they just got this decree that they're not going to be safe. And if we can empathize with that, then we're supposed to now retroactively maybe empathize with Esav too and see his sadness. And I think that this is how I wanted to start off the framing for this evening, because we can maybe think of lots of reasons why we shouldn't empathize with Esav. In the long run, Esav is going to try and kill Yaakov, and he is portrayed as the enemy. But here we have a midrash that helps explain that maybe this very human reaction to cry and be sad, especially when he did not get what he was supposed to have gotten, that now maybe we can see a little bit of humanity in that. And maybe it can make us question, why did Yaakov do this to begin with? And what exactly, not necessarily were his motivations, but why was it okay that he got to treat Esav this way? Especially inside the text, I don't know if it's absolutely clear. That's what we'll see this evening. If it's fair that Esav got treated that way, we could come up with lots of reasons in the future about him being evil, that maybe it was justified. But maybe there's something here to Esav crying and us thinking, well, what did Yaakov do? And since we are his descendants, maybe we should be thinking about what he did wrong and what we can learn from it. So that's where I want to go this evening. Okay. Gonna switch to the slide. All right, so let's look at the text. Let's go all the way back. As we remember from that verse, Esav talks about the birthright being taken from him and also the blessing. So let's look at that in depth. So let's look at the actual text before we get to any specific reads. So this is after there's this oracle kind of telling where Rivka feels her twins inside of her that are eventually going to be Yaakov and Esav, and we hear this kind of prophecy that what the older is going to work for the younger. We don't actually know exactly what that means, and it's also unclear if Yaakov and Esav know about this oracle prophecy in and of itself. But now we're going to see the story that you might be familiar with of the lentil stew, and maybe we'll notice some things that maybe we had not noticed before, and we'll see kind of where different Talmudic texts take that in different directions. So we are in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 25, verse 27. Vayigdalu hana'arim, vayhi Esav ish yodei tzayid ish sadeh, v'Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim. So we are coming in with this dichotomy of the twins, that they are different. I didn't even put in the description of them before about how one is hairy and one is not. Okay, so they grow up. Esav becomes this man who knows how to hunt and be in the field. The sadeh also is like an interesting description. There are only two other times so far in Tanakh where sadeh has come up. The first is Yitzchak praying in the sadeh, but the sadeh is also where Cain kills Hevel. So there's already like a more violent kind of energy happening in the sadeh, and that is where Esav is. And Yaakov is a simple man, whatever that means, sitting in tents. So that's supposed to be extremely dichotomous. We have the action-packed, sporty twin, and then we have the more bookish twin in the tent. Ve'hav Yitzchak et Esav ki tzayid b'fiv, Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. So another distinction between the two: Yitzchak loves Esav, presumably because Esav is able to give him some game from his hunting, and Rivka loves Yaakov. Vayazid Yaakov nazid, vayavo Esav min hasadeh v'hu hayef. And Yaakov made some lentil stew, or made some stew. We don't know yet; it's lentil. And Esav comes from the field, and he's very hungry. I think that's important to note here, this double language. There are going to be different passages that we see coming up that pick up on this Vayazed Yaakov Nazir and say that there's a reason for this double language. It's coming to teach us something significant. Vayomer Esav el Yaakov, hal iteni na min ha'adom hazeh, ki ayif anochi, akein kra shemo Edom. So Esav says to Yaakov, please take for me from this red stuff. I don't even know the best way to translate it, because it's so powerful in the original Hebrew to have this repetitive, the red readiness, that he's just so hungry and so focused on the goal of getting the food that it's almost like he's like lost the sense of like being able to communicate about it properly because he's tired. And then we have like a funny narrative like outside of what's happening, saying like, and that's why he's called Edom, eventually in the long run, that his people will be Edom, because it sounds like red. Okay. Vayomer Yaakov, Michrach hayom et bechoratcha li. And Yaakov says, great, I'll give you the soup, but how about you sell to me in exchange your birthright? Vayomer Esav, Hinei anochi holech lamut, velama ze li bechora. And Esav says, okay, I'm going to die, right? I'm so hungry. Like, what is the point of having this birthright to begin with? Basically him saying, yeah, I'll do the trade. Vayomer Yaakov, Hishava li kayom, v'yishava lo, v'yimkor et bechorato leYaakov. And Yaakov says, great, swear it to me, right? It's not just like this willy-nilly, you'll say that you'll do it. Let's make a real oath that you're going to do that. They do the oath, and that then leads to this technical legal transaction that now the birthright is Yaakov's. V'Yaakov natan le'Esav lechem u'nezid adashim, v'yochal v'yesh v'Yaakov v'yilach, v'yivez Esav et ha'bechora. So Yaakov then says, great, we technically have now done this selling, so you should get the stew. And he also gets some bread. Esav eats it, and then it says that he has spurned the birthright. It's an interesting term. Bizayon in like modern Hebrew would be like a desecration. It's like more funny in the vernacular if you're talking to teenage Israelis, being like, "Oh, Esav bizayon," when they're talking about like a breakup or like something quite trivial, and then they're using like these intense words. But it's the same root that Esav has now spurned or desecrated his birthright. And what's interesting here is that there's like a need to even say that, right? Like we know that the transaction technically happened. We saw that before in the language of the selling being done, but there seems to be something added extra that's not just that Esav sold the birthright. It's that by doing so, he seems to have degraded the birthright altogether. So, as usual, when it comes to Torah text, there's lots of things to be said, even in this typical literal pshat understanding. And we're going to look at certain texts that pick up on that. For me, a way that I like doing parshanut or commentary is there's the usual commentaries, and we'll look at a few medieval commentaries. But to me, also, I really like looking at Talmudic texts that might be having conversations that don't seem at all to be connected to the Torah text, but I think actually in and of themselves sometimes are their own kind of commentary to what's going on. So we're going to be doing quite a bit of that today. Okay, so first we'll do some more stereotypical commentators you'd see on the pages of a Mikra Ugdolot Chumash. This is Sforno. Sforno, I believe, is Italian. And he brings in some legal language into what's going on. When Yaakov gives the soup to Esav, he says, "Liknot bikinyan chalipin benazid o bekli asher bo hanazid al derech shlaf ish na'alo v'natan le're'ehu." And he's providing this legal language of different kinds of ways to do a kinyan or an acquisition within halacha. A chalipin kinyan is when you pick up something to designate that you've bought it. If you've ever done mechirat chametz at your shul, you might have seen your shul rabbi pick up or you might have picked up a pen or something like that. I feel like that's what a lot of people do in modern Orthodox shuls. But that is signifying that the acquisition has happened. And what Sforno is saying is that specifically the acquisition was done by picking up or eating the soup, or maybe even the container for the soup, and he compares it as well to an example all the way from Root, which is kind of funny, of this taking off your shoe and passing it to another person. In Root, this is some kind of proto-chalitza, proto-levirate marriage, where this is how they're transferring the ability for Ruth to marry outside of the closest relative to her deceased husband. But what's interesting about this is that's an example of proto-chalitza being a way to determine inheritance, and you pick up an object. And so too here, by Yaakov passing the soup, or the thing holding the soup, to Esav, that now another shift in inheritance has happened. Okay, so thank you for the technical legal language, Sforno. I'm sure Yaakov was very aware of all the different kinds of kinyanim. And now we have another clarification about the Vayivez Esav Bechora, that Esav spurned it. What is that coming to teach us by showing us this extra wording? And so it says, Gam achar ma'aseh haita bechora be'enav bilti ruya lo to hamachir shepasko. So they're clarifying now something about the nature of the sale, right? If we're going into like technical legal hat, there are people here who are much better at economics and finance than I am, but they're noticing that it doesn't seem right that the birthright, which is a huge deal, would be at the same status of a bowl of soup. So even though it doesn't seem to be that those would be the same, that because Esav was so ready to do this kind of acquisition that like really does not seem to be one for one, that shows that actually Esav didn't really care about the birthright. And then it seems like the Sforno is tacking on this point of to say, therefore he wasn't cheated because he didn't really want the birthright anyway, so it didn't really feel like a scam. And I appreciate what Sforno is doing here by like putting on this more legal hat, but it actually, I think, opens up an avenue of saying, wait a minute, was there a Havamina? Was there this assumption that actually this kind of looks like Yaakov is cheating Esav? And sometimes by responding to or rejecting a potential initial concern, we're actually validating that concern was there to begin with. And that's kind of where I want to take this in that direction now. I'm just checking the comments. Great question about even if one can sell a birthright, that's going to come up, right? Like, what does it mean to sell a birthright? It's a status. You can have a shift in status that sometimes happens like via an acquisition, but this is quite shocking. Like there seems to be something that's very much connected to blood and family tree, and so it's like kind of weird that you'd be able to sell it to begin with. So yeah, that's a great point. That's a great about birthright stories in the Jews. That could be its own anti-Semitism share that I'm sure that Torah Motion could do another time, but good question. Okay. So now I want to look at some of these Talmudic texts that I was talking about, where it might not necessarily always be directly talking about our story, but I think it's actually coming to shed some light onto it. So here is a story from Masechet Brachot, where there's lots of discussions about blessings, and they focus a lot on Leah being one of the matriarchs to bless God, and actually in the text is, according to Masechet Brachot, is one of the strongest blessers of God. And so then they start going to this like fun tangent of the names of her children, because the names of her children often show how she was blessing God. So here she talks about Reuven. It says, Reuven, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amra Leah, Re'u ma bein beni leben chami. So they're picking up on the funny phrasing of Reuven, which is Reuven. But if you were to split it up into Reuven, it looks like saying, look, son, my son. And what she's trying to say here is, look at my son in comparison to the son of my father-in-law, i.e. my brother-in-law. What does that mean? Aval gav de midate zavna lebecherte dichti vayimkor et bechorato leYaakov chazo maktive vayistom esav et Yaakov v'uchti vayomer hachi kra shemo Yaakov vayakveni zeh hamayim begomer. So let's compare Reuven to Esav. How are we going to do that? With Esav, in which he was fully aware that he was losing his birthright status, and because it explicitly says that he sold the birthright, but then he gets really mad, right? It says that Esav hated Yaakov, and then he even like gets mad at him in the way that we saw all the way at the beginning. How did Yaakov trick me in these two ways? Ilu beni, but my son Reuven is so different than Esav. How? Aval gav de al kurche shakle Yaakov levecherte mine dichtiv uvechalalo yitzuei aviv nitna lebechorato levnei Yosef afilu hachi la akanebe dichtiv vayishma Reuven veyatzileu miadam. So we're gonna have, this is a very strange proof. It's a lot of mixing around of history that doesn't really feel so clear. But what Leah is saying is, well, my son Reuven, who is forced to give up his birthright because he's the firstborn, and Yosef eventually is going to be the chosen one. And it says the reason why he gave it up the birthright is because he slept with his father's concubines, which is like a funny proof, because that sounds like Reuven is a very willing actor or participant in the shift. But the way that she's explaining is that it wasn't his choice, in the same way that Esav explicitly sells his birthright. Even then, that he lost his birthright, he still wants to save Yosef. When Yosef gets taken by the brothers to be thrown in the pit, and they're debating what to do with him, Reuven steps up and says, no, we should make sure that he's safe. We shouldn't do anything bad to him. So this is very strange logic. The quick summary of it is saying that Esav and Reuven are different. Esav willingly sold the birthright and got mad at Yaakov. Reuven unwillingly got rid of his birthright and yet still took care of Yosef. And I feel like it's a little bit jumbled, because I think kind of like that end of that sforno is that even though we're trying to say that Esav is bad, we're reckoning with also that maybe it would be really fair that Esav would be very frustrated with having the birthright taken from him. And comparing it to this story about Reuven and Yosef in particular, where maybe Reuven didn't understand the implications of sleeping with his father's concubines, that would get rid of his birthright. It's not that he was forced to give away his birthright altogether. He was still a very active participant, and maybe even the Talmudic logic not being so perfect, that might actually be telling us something about what we think about Esav, and giving a little bit more validity to the frustration that Esav might be feeling. And if you're not convinced of that, Reed, I have something that I feel like is even more so that. This one first, actually. This is a source from Masechet Sota that doesn't seem to really initially be anything about our sugya, but all of a sudden, our parsha, but then they use a verse in our parsha to prove something. They're talking about the Egyptians after the Red Sea splits, and then that they get drowned by the Red Sea. And it says, Inami, hu eino mevi, avahim ba'im v'noflim betocho. So the flood doesn't come upon them, but the water falls upon them. Okay, what does that mean? They're talking just about the logistics of the water, that the water fell on them. Why is that fitting for the Egyptians to receive as a punishment? V'hainu demar Rabbi Elazar, my dichtiv kiba devar asher zadu alehem biktera shebishlu ba'anit bashlu. Because it's like the same measure for measure kind of discussion from before. Based off of this verse that Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, says, describing what he saw, what that happened to the Egyptians, that eventually got him to believe in the Jewish God. it's basically saying this tit for tat thing, right? The Egyptians drowned Israelite baby boys, therefore the Egyptian soldiers should also get treated by the water this way. But the choice in verb is weird. The way that Yitro describes it is asher zadu alihem, that the Egyptians conspired against them. And then the Gemara says, let's figure out actually what that means. My mashma the high zadu lishna dikterahu dichtiv vayazed Yaakov nazid. So they go, wait a minute, what exactly does zadu mean here? And then they take the proof from our story where it says that Yaakov made the stew, vayazed nazid, taking that same shoresh, that same verb, noticing the same zayin and dalid there, that that's how we learn from our story that it means to conspire or trick. Here it means, I mean, it's like not technically that in our story. In our story, it meant like stirring the stew, making it warm. By putting it in the context, though, of all of this trickery, we seem to be correlating our story, the Yaakov story that we're using as a proof text, with this kind of trickery that we're using to even explain how the Egyptians treated the Israelite babies, which is pretty extreme. So I think what's happening here is that when there's a Talmudic text that then decides to quote a verse from the Torah to prove its point, there are many verses in the Torah that it could have used in order to prove this verb, but it chooses our story, therefore casting it in this more trickery kind of light. So I think that in itself also is a kind of commentary to this experience, and saying that it's not super clear that Yaakov's actions were totally good and that Esav's were totally bad. It seems like it was a situation that was somewhat precarious and had some trickery involved. Here's another commentary to kind of stress the problematizing of this. It's very legal language, so I'm going to just, I think, talk about it on the outside. This is from the Beit Halevi, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, senior or number one of the Soloveitchik dynasty, the first Brisker Rav. For those who are unfamiliar with the Brisker Derech, often that kind of way of legally thinking is very technical, and I think that is what he is trying to do here. He's reckoning with the idea that how could Yaakov have even sold the birthright, which is what someone brought up before, like how is it even possible to do something like that? And also, there's no way that Yaakov actually could have wanted to do something like that unless Esav himself wasn't worthy. And it seems like what they're trying to do with this like legalism of this situation, which you wonder, like when you look at the original pshat of the text, it doesn't feel like Yaakov was thinking, how legally, technically can I make this acquisition work? It just seems like Yaakov was trying to get something. And it seems like now the Beit Halevi is kind of superimposing all this legal language, similar to the Sforno that we saw, talking about the different kinds of acquisitions you can make. But it becomes this whole back and forth discussion of like, what kind of acquisition could it have been? Is it even possible? Because you can't really sell a birthright, and there's no way that Esav really could have wanted it, so it must be fine. And it feels like sometimes like an Occam's razor, and this is where I keep on building towards, that the more you try and justify something legally, like maybe actually there's something wrong. Like maybe it should be super clear why Yaakov did it, but if we keep on trying to make up all of these reasons why he did it, maybe there's an issue with what Yaakov did in the first place. I think that one of the commentators that asks this question the most strongly is the Ran, the Drashot Haran, where in his commentary trying to explain the significant differences between Esav and Yaakov, he talks about this issue, and I think he says it like the most strongly, and it was very exciting to me to see it. You know, he wrote this 600 plus years ago, and say like, yes, like even he had these moral qualms with what was going on. So he says, also, let's now talk about what happened between Yaakov and Esav. What happened between the two is a lot of hatred and envy, right? We're not going to say that, what Yaakov did is totally fine. Actually, the actions that happened between the two, like no wonder there would be so much hatred and envy. Okay, what is the first thing that would do that? Rishona, asher lakach Yaakov bechorat Esav b'inyan zar me'od, tzarich yishuv. Firstly, the way that Yaakov takes the birthright from Esav, that is a very strange matter, and we need to answer it. Like, we need to figure out what is going on there. Ki echaya mechok Yaakov ish tam lemor le'Esav shimkor elav bechorato benazid anashim. How could Yaakov ish tam, the simple man, like come up with this conniving way to sell a birthright just for having lentil soup? Like that doesn't match the persona that we can imagine this like young bookish man coming up with this whole scheme. That there's just so much shock and wonder that he could do something like this. Rishona ki ein bechok hashalim sheitein einav b'ma sheino shalo lomar lere'ehu bechora nechalatcha li, which is again a question that came up in the comments. Like, first of all, how could we even begin trying to talk about selling a birthright or someone's inheritance? Like that is shocking. That is not Yaakov's to be asking for. V'shenit eich yoneu lakachat mimenu bechora nichbeza b'mechir bazui v'shasuin. Like, how could he do it in this not grandiose way, kind of similar to a source we saw earlier? Like, how could you ask for the birthright in response to just getting a bowl of soup? Even for the best bowl of soup in the world, this is the birthright we're talking about. Like, how could these things be equal? And then at the end, all the way, the last four words, Rashod Haran says, like, we really need to figure this out. This is a huge moral problem. In the end, the way he explains it, he says that Esav was a bad man, and therefore was justified for Yaakov to be doing all these things. But I think the way that he asks the questions, he's not like beating around the bush, I think, in the same way some of these other commentators are. He's saying this is a huge moral problem and we need to figure it out. Okay, this is the source that this is what I was waiting to bring. I'll say that I read this source in Daf Yomi a few months ago, and I immediately thought about this week's Parsha, and I was like, perfect, one day I'm going to talk about the connection between these two things. And now I have the opportunity. So I appreciate that you're all along for the ride for this, because these sources do not feel connected at all to what initially we're looking at. So let's take a step back for a moment. We were talking about Yaakov and Esav. And now let's go back to the world of acquisitions, but in particular marriage acquisitions, because that's how marriage works in the Gemara. In Masechet Kedushin, which is discussing all of these kinds of acquisitions, there are some really funny stories that involve like what happens when you throw a certain object at a woman, and does she take it? Does it count as Kedushin? I mean, these stories are like funny, but also sometimes deeply troubling, right? Like, why is this? What exactly is the Gemara doing here? Are we trying to make up fun theoretical cases to prove like how strong certain halachic mechanisms are, or like maybe using people's lives isn't a fun theoretical? But in this section that I brought in are different examples of when a woman asks for something and then the man says, I will give you the thing on condition that it counts as a kind of acquisition for our marriage. And she still wants the object, but not necessarily for Kedushin purposes. And the question is, does it work? So bear with me here. We're going to look at it and maybe you'll see a connection to our story. So the first one is Hitkadshi li v'kikar tneu lekelev eina mekudeshet. So if a man says, let's do Kedushin via this loaf of bread, and then the woman says, give it to this dog, that doesn't count as Kedushin. But if the dog was hers, then it would count, because maybe that shows that it's like within her jurisdiction. By Rav Mari, Kelev ratz achareha mahu. What if the dog is chasing her? So like it's not because she wants to feed her dog, but because she's trying to get the dog away from her. And maybe that changes our idea of how much consent she has or intention she has in this acquisition. Bahu hana'a dika matzal nafsha mine gamra. That's basically, it's talking exactly what I was saying. Like, is it that she wants the benefit of the specific loaf, or is it that she's trying to be safe? She could say like the Torah tells you that you should save me, right? Because the dog is seemingly, I guess, trying to hurt her. That you shouldn't need to have some kind of bread or promise to marry me in order to save me. You have a mitzvah to save a person who is unsafe. Okay, so that's a funny case, and it ends in a teiku. We don't know what to do with that case because it's a little bit silly. Another case that we have is the bread, but then saying to give it to a poor person, does it not count? Okay, another funny case has to do with like selling beads. Okay, but let's go to the case that I really want, and this is the one that's highlighted in the yellow. There was a certain man who was selling wine in a store. Amrale, a woman came in and said, Havli chad kasa, give me 1 cup of your drink, of your wine. Amarla, mikadasht li. Well, if you get the wine, if you take the wine, will that count as Kedushin? Will it be like as if we are married? Amrale, akoshe ashkayan. And then she says, just give me the drink. Just give it to me. Amar Chama ko ashkoye ashkan lav klumhu. And Rav Chama says that just because she says oh, give me the drink, it doesn't count for anything, right? So the situation is she's thirsty. She comes into the store. She asks for wine. And the man says, oh, if I give you the wine, that's going to count as our Kiddushin. Do you agree with that? And she goes, just give me the drink. I'm so thirsty. That sounds like maybe that could potentially count. And yet Rav Chama is saying, no, it does not count. She obviously is just thirsty. She's not able to actually make a decision that is clear-minded, where she's clearly consenting. And therefore, it does not count. And to me, when I read this story for the first time, I immediately thought of our story about Yaakov and Esav, because here we have Esav coming from the field. He is thirsty. He is tired. He actually is so hungry, ravenously hungry. He thinks he's going to die. And he comes into the tent, and Yaakov says, great, I'll give you the food on one condition. You sell me your birthright. And Esav says, just give me the food. And even the double language is also what stuck out to me, right? The min ha'adom hazeh. When describing the lentil soup, when Esav just says, like, give me this red readiness, the double language shows like how unable he is to actually focus on anything else. And here, that double language, Rav Chama says, is proof that we cannot count this as a valid acquisition, because the woman is so thirsty that she can't actually make such a huge life decision, which is very different, though, than our story in the Tanakh, where that did count as a valid acquisition, at least according to the text outside, right, where it says that Esav did sell a vayimkor and that he spurned the birthright. So to me, what I think is interesting here is that it could be that these stories are just totally unconnected, but I feel like the double language is interesting. And then it's even more powerful that that Chazal are saying, actually, what happened in the Tanakh story should not have been how it should have played out legally. Maybe what Yaakov did not only was not ethical, but didn't even work from a legal standpoint. It's not fair to expect Esav to be able to make a valid acquisition while so focused on being able to sustain himself and to not feel like he's going to die. In case we weren't sure that coercion is not a valid way to necessarily be beholden to certain things, you might be familiar with another story in the Gemara, which is a story about God forcing Mount Sinai on the Israelite people and saying that if you do not follow the Torah, this will be the Har Kigit, the Har Kigit is the mountain being forced upon, almost like a bull upon the people, and that if you don't follow the law, this will be where your graves are. That story is very intense, and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says there we have an issue, because there it sounds like maybe you wouldn't have to necessarily keep Torah anymore, right? Because it was done out of coercion, which is why at the end of that story, actually very similar to all the way back to the beginning of this year, we have a quote from Esther, where we need to see another time where Bnei Israel took on the Torah willingly and consensually and not coercively. But this story in and of itself, and this Rashi here was just stressing that it was under duress, shows that any kind of promise to do something under duress cannot count as a valid acquisition. So we have that from this story. That's like a more fun Agadah version that maybe we're familiar with from Shavuot or other times where we've talked about obligation and Torah. We have from this obscure case in Kiddushin that is obscure, but is talking about a very similar food situation than our story in Tanakh. And we see how it's very different than how it plays out. It shows that Yaakov's actions are both like not valid from a technical kinyan acquisition standpoint, and therefore also like are morally wrong. How could you ask someone to do something when they're under duress? How could you force them to give a certain answer? So to me, I was very excited about that Kiddushin Sugya case, so I'm happy I got to show it. But to me, I feel like there are different times within the Talmudic text that problematize Yaakov in like very interesting ways. We could just say Yaakov's a bad person, which we wouldn't do because he is still the avot. But I think that doing it in these like very interesting ways that provide different angles really highlight the like what exactly was going wrong in a way that I find quite interesting. Okay, before we move on to maybe talking about the stealing of the blessing, I'm just going to check the chat. Yes, these marriage cases are very funny. Sima, you have a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Okay. I just was thinking that there's one difference between that Kiddushin example and the case of Yaakov narrative, and that is that in the Kiddushin example, the woman just says, I'm thirsty, but she doesn't acknowledge what he's proposing to her, whereas Esav does say something about the Bechorah. So he is at least aware that there is some conversation. He's not just saying, he's not ignoring the conversation or the Tanai.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like in the text, it does explicitly say, it doesn't just say that he's super hungry. It says that, well, at this point, I'm going to die, so why not just sell the birthright? So I think that's important to note. I think that the situations feel similar enough to me that at least I feel like it needs to be some kind of commentary or addressing of the issue, or that you could say something at that stage and just be so tunnel vision about getting that food that you could kind of say anything. But I think you're right that there is like that technical wording difference that might save us here. But even if it technically works, it does show us still like the problem of what duress can lead to. So yeah, that's a helpful point. Thank you. Great. And yes, this point about in the Kedushin case where she wants the drink, well, for Esav, maybe he didn't actually need the Bechorah. I think that's like what these other commentators, the Beit Halevi, and maybe even I'm trying to remember who else. Oh, even with the story in Brachot, like are showing us is that maybe he didn't want it, so it's not a big deal to sell it. Even so, I still feel like Yaakov being our forefather, and forefather of like what the Jewish people are supposed to be, I would like to think that he would do it on better terms. Okay, let's briefly look at the blessings. I have less to say about like the significance of stealing of the blessing. I mean, I feel like it's a little bit more like slaps in your face of Yaakov is literally masquerading and lying in order to get it in a way that feels different than the coercion example. But I do think that the power of some of this midrash and also the Barbanel we're about to look at, I think are interesting, especially because I don't sense that the Torah and Motion bunch are necessarily people who think that there's nothing to critique about our forefathers, but I think it's helpful to show that it's not just us and our modern sensibilities doing that, but even within midrash and commentary, there seems to be a reckoning with it. So this one I think is very powerful. This is about an interaction between Leah and Yaakov, where it describes that Yaakov hated her. Vayar Hashem ki snua Leah. God sees that Leah is the hated between her and her sister, who's also married to Yaakov. This eventually is what's going to lead to God opening up her womb and being able to have children while Rachel cannot. And so the question is, why was she hated? And what is interesting here is we see like an interesting back and forth. So what I want to skip to here is in the middle. Vayomer Yaakov el Lavan havali et ishti v'gomer. After all this working back and forth for Rachel, Yaakov says, okay, it's been 7 years. It's time for me to get Rachel. So Lavan does some trickery, right? And he says, no, you're not going to get Rachel first. You're going to get Leah. Kol halayla hayta asa atzma kerachel. The whole night of their first night of marriage, one wonders what how come that gimmick was able to last that long. But Leah acts like Rachel, and Yaakov doesn't notice. Kivan shema baboker v'hinei hi Leah, and then all of a sudden in the morning he wakes up, he sees in the sunlight that actually it was not Rachel, it was Leah. Amar la. Lama ramitoti. You daughter of a scammer, a ruffian, like you cheated me, right, by tricking him. Amralo v'ata lama ramita avicha. And she says, yeah, you think that I'm so bad? You tricked your father. So that also is an example of a midah keneg midah, measure for measure kind of thing, because Yaakov did this trickery. Makes sense that eventually in the long run he also would have this experience of trickery to kind of get a taste of his own medicine. It's obviously like a pretty strong or stinging way to say it, but I think that there's something there, that there's something quite troubling that Yaakov would be doing so much trickery, and there needs to be some kind of retribution, which we even saw all the way back to the midrash about Esav and the people in Shushan, that like because Yaakov did something wrong to Esav, therefore there needs to be something done wrong to Yaakov or his descendants in the long run. That's how justice is supposed to work. So I thought this was like a really fascinating midrash to show that. I also think it's like a beautiful portrayal of Leah. I mean, it's sad, but the amount of I don't know if it's agency, but like she's like a moral voice in a way that I don't feel like is super necessarily clear from the text itself in the Pshat, that she's here to bring moral clarity. And not only that, there's like a deep psychological point of this is why she is hated, right? That was originally what was asked, is that I think a lot of us can relate that sometimes hearing the deepest truths about yourself you can get kind of defensive at first and be frustrated at the person that told you that. And eventually, hopefully in the long run, you'll realize and be able to absorb in a healthier way those truths. But this is why Yaakov hates her, is that she's telling him like it is. She's pointing out his flaws as a person and he can't handle it. And eventually then the justice that she receives is that she's able to have the children, which obviously is like a very troubling way to think about justice, but fits into the narrative pretty well. This Abarbanel I got from a friend of mine who might be on the chat here. If so, Ned, thank you very much. This is an amazing Abarbanel that goes all the way to the encounter between Yaakov and Esav, where they meet after Yaakov has fought with the angel. And what he says is, actually, I'm giving my blessing back to you, as in I stole this blessing from you, Esav, and actually I'm here to return it to you. Part of that reconciling wasn't just to make up, but actually there's a sense that Yaakov made a mistake and he needs to return it back to him. What does that actually mean? That like goes back to our question of like, what does it mean to sell a birthright? But it seems to be that here that it's not just about making up, but that part of the way to reconcile is that Yaakov needs to admit that he did something wrong and right or wrong, which I think is very interesting. So the way I want to kind of end off, and I don't know if there'll be like some space for questions or comments, but where I want to take this is, when I was initially planning this year, the part that I had trouble with is trying to figure out, why exactly am I showing this to you? I don't want to just go around saying bad things about Yaakov. I don't think on the one hand, I think we know that, right, like the Avot that we know were people as well, and they have flaws, but there has to be a reason for me to be providing it in these different lenses. And what I want to argue is that being able to show commentaries and to learn about issues that appear in our text is actually like part of the tikkun of the problem. Not to say that therefore every wrong that's done in the past can be fixed by having a shir about it, but that actually part of the beauty of Torah and Torah Sheba'al Peh is that we can see a problem that appears in our history and in our past, and it becomes our job as interpreters to figure out ways to understand it that then can help us understand how to be better people in the future. So it's not about necessarily being apologetic and explaining away what our ancestors did, but to see the issues by teasing out in these different lenses. Like we saw, we have like the lens of how much consent was involved, or how much of coercion was involved, by seeing the lens of, well, was the issue that the birthright and the lentils like not really a one-for-one kind of acquisition. How could Yaakov feel like he could do that? Is it because Esav was eventually going to be evil? I think that all of these questions tease out different ways of thinking about like, what are the right ways to ask each other of things? What are the right ways to do acquisitions? And I think that like that's part of our job as being inheritors of this tradition, being inheritors of Yaakov, is being able to reckon with these things, not to pretend that they didn't happen, or to say that we have different understandings of like how certain moral questions work now, therefore we should ignore the things in the past, but that by us reckoning with them now in the live, that is actually part of how we're going to make this all better. So I wanted to look at some sources about that, and that's how we'll wrap up. So first we have from Rav Yosef Albo in his Sefer Ikarim. Also, I believe, he's a Spanish rabbi from the medieval time period, where he kind of says exactly what I was saying, that this is part of what Torah Sheba'al Peh is. We are a religion that has written and oral Torah, and the goal of oral Torah is to be able to make sense of the written Torah in our specific times. And not just תספיק בכל הזמנים, לפי שהפרטים המתחדשים תמיד בענייני האנשים, המשפטים והדברים הנפלאים הם רבים מאוד, שיכללים בספר. So what he's saying here is that there's no way we could have had this all written in the written Torah. Like, it would have been a book too big. If we were going to be writing all the different ways throughout different generations, we would be understanding people differently, understanding law differently. And I think that this is a cool articulation of the point that I made, that part of what the goal of Torah Sheba'al Peh is that every generation we're going to come in with a new sense of things that we find troubling, we want to reckon with, and it's going to be the job of Torah Sheba'al Peh to provide a different lens. In a more obscure example, this is from Professor Charlotte von Robert. She's a contemporary professor at Stanford. And she does a lot of work on Nida, on menstrual law in particular, and she talks about like different ways we can talk about Nida in the 21st century. We could be talking about Nida in a way that's kind of was sexist and saying, oh, the rabbis from Sasanian Persia, they didn't understand anything about modern science and they were sexist. Or you could come up with these more like apologetic ways to talk about Nida, which is that's actually not the point. The point is that we need to like look at the texts, treat them as they are, and then see our ability to talk about them and provide different lenses as ways to like slowly weave this tapestry of understanding of what they are. And I think that she articulates it quite nicely at the bottom here. We pick up threads that have been left hanging and continue to spin with them, adding different colors and textures to the web to use the text as a springboard for philosophical and poetic reflections on the function of the body and religion. Either way, the Talmud will have a different future, and the Talmudic Beit Midrash will change its collective face in ultimately unpredictable ways. So here she's talking specifically about Nida and about women, but I think that this is yet another example of a moral question that might feel particular to a more modern sensibility, and that even just by us talking about it and reckoning with it and trying to tease out these different ways that we might see problems, that's not denigrating to Yaakov, but that like actually us doing this is like what it means to be a part of oral tradition. And I think that that's even within Yaakov's name himself, right? All the way back at the beginning, when we were talking about Esav picking up on the Yaakveni, the trickery, or the usurping within Yaakov's name, we see that Yaakov has a name shift, right? This is a few parshiot away from now. This is when Yaakov is wrestling with the angel, and afterward, Yaakov gets a different name. V'yomer lo Yaakov v'yamer od shimcha ki im Yisrael ki sarite Elohim v'im anashim v'tuchal. That your name is not going to be Yaakov anymore. It's going to be Yisrael, because you have struggled with God and with people and have prevailed. And Rashi explains that part of this name change is, right, like he literally struggled with an angel, but because we don't want anymore to say that Yaakov came from this place of immorality and being able to take blessings and to take birthrights and to be taking them immorally, it's better to have this name, the name that is about struggle and reckoning. That I guess like the shift, that the spin that I would like to take on it, reckoning with these different things. It's actually a part of who we are. Not only that, the Rambam in his Hilchot Tshuva, when it comes to repentance, talks about name changing as being one of the requirements for Tshuva. That actually what Yaakov is doing by changing his name, recognizing maybe the things he did in his past should not be the things that define him anymore, that he needs to learn from them. That's actually a part of the tshuva, of the repentance process altogether. And I think stated quite eloquently in Rav Shmuel Klitzer's book, Wrestling Jacob, he says, a close reading of various biblical texts, however, may reveal that the more dominant theme in the Hebrew Bible is that of a divinely inspired human autonomy and an uncompromising demand on high for human accountability. Ultimately, it is an invitation to mere mortals to transcend their self-imposed limits, to develop their innate divine image, to struggle with themselves, and even to struggle with God and prevail. If a similarity between the psychoanalysis enterprise and the biblical narratives emerges from the texts themselves, it would seem to be found in the biblical hero's struggle to achieve identity and autonomy. This seems to occur much as in therapeutic model by courageously confronting our own masquerades and evasions. So what Rav Klitzner is saying here is that Yaakov is paradigmatic for how we all can kind of reckon with these difficult things in our lives. Here's someone with a very troubled, immoral past, but here's someone also who learns how to reinvent himself and carry those things with him and learn from them beyond. It could be in the way of the Barbanel, of the returning of the blessing. It could be in our own understanding of how we interpret it in different ways and kind of call out some of these actions as immoral through these different Talmudic texts that we saw, whether it be that very funny Kiddushin case, or using our story as the example to learn about the term that means conspiring. Those are all ways that we're casting the Yaakov story in a darker light. But by doing that, we're able to then say, and this is what we're going to be learning to do good in the future. And I think that's kind of what it means to be part of the Jewish people. Like there's a reason why our name is Yisrael. And so I hope that by kind of using this as like a meta case study of this issue tonight, we can take away that yes, there can be troubling things in our past and in the ways that we have gotten here, but that our job now is not to sit and wallow in it, but our job as inheritors of Yisrael is about trying to figure out different lenses in which to see those issues, and then from there kind of take away these new ways of understanding how we should be in the world.
Thank you. So, yeah, of course, Sophia, that's what you're talking about. There's a long, long tradition of critiquing the Avot and Imahot. One championed, I guess, in our generation, Nechama Leibowitz always said our sages were no respecters of person. Often, I had the pleasure to learn with her and pointing out, and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was big into this, the idea, and Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, all said the same point you made, of course, that if our avot are perfect, we can't learn from them because we're not perfect. So by humanizing them, we can learn from that. It's just whatever. But any questions? Okay, Yashikov, thank you very much for that and all the wonderful sources. Any comments, questions? There may be a couple things in the chat box you didn't get to. If you want to take a quick look, I'm not even sure.
Sure. My source sheet is available.
Yeah, it's on the website. I put it here in the thing, but it's also, we post the source sheet on the website. So you go to the Torah in Motion website, the Parsha, the Parsha page, you'll find the sources are there. All our sources from all our classes are always posted on the website. So,
yes.
we have, not everybody has sources all the time, but that's yes.
There's a question in the chat about from Bela Yaniv. I'm not sure I understand the question, but is it that how could Yaakov we know that he receives a Bechor on the end, but based off of these actions so far, like how could he have been worthy of receiving it? Is that what you meant? If that is oh no, would you like to clarify what you meant?
I'm trying to figure out too. I don't know. All right, don't I'm trying to quickly read the comments.
How would the story have been written the right way? I mean, I do think this is right, I think what Rabbi Jay, you're pointing out is that there's a history of pointing out the flaws of the Avot and Imahot. But I think what I'm trying to argue is that actually there's also it's not just oh, we're going to talk about it, but actually it's important and good that they're modeling that for us. Because it shows how then we can learn from our own mistakes as well, and that our job is to learn from those mistakes. So I don't know if there's a right way. I actually think that writing it in this flawed way might be helpful. If we're really taking the Yaakov imagery much stronger, all the way later again with the wrestling with the angel, that Yaakov is limping, that becomes an image for the Jewish people forever, right? That we don't eat the sinew. What's the gid hanasheh? You don't eat the the hamstring, part of an animal. That seems to be a symbol that we're always focusing on, maybe a sense of flaw, and that's actually a part of who we are. And that maybe there is no right way, and that's more about how we're going to deal with those flaws and put them in our narratives.
And you got me thinking about why, I would say, I guess if you want to go back to modern, sort of our generation, whatever, the people who took the opposite approach, Ravon Cutler, the founder of Lakewood, had the total opposite approach, that it's borders on heresy to give our human readings into the Avot. And you kind of wonder if it's connected to the breakdown in tradition. It's not so much in Parshanut, it's so much on trying to ensure that in an era where most Jews were becoming not religious, they felt it more important. I don't know, this is maybe my psychoanalysis of why that, but it is interesting because I don't think that's I remember Rav Lichtenstein once talking about it. It's the traditional approach in the Midrashim, left and right, is sort of the approach you were giving. I'm just sort of wondering out loud. It's interesting. I think in the 20th century, in many parts of our traditional world, people who takes Torah very seriously, many of them sort of have an opposite approach, and it's kind of interesting. But there's much what you say. All right, anybody else? Any comments? Everybody's so quiet.
The last question is a great question. I can't answer that one, but you can take what you want with this being something we're thinking about right now. How do we take things that are in our past and then work on making them better in the future? I think that's relevant all the time.
What was the last question?
Ethical implications for now.
Yeah, that's
a whole other share.
There have to be.
There have to be.
Torah's current events, everything in the Torah is for now. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in the Torah. That's why
I'd like to know, why do you think it's important to perfect our ancestors? Why can't we accept them as flawed individuals?
I mean, my guess is that there's something psychological there, very similar to that midrash about Leah and Yaakov, is that, right, like that he hates her for pointing out his flaws, that by saying that people that you have as role models are flawed, that can be difficult to hear. It's much easier to have unflawed characters in life, to have less nuance. So my guess is that it would just be easier to say that people are the people that we respect are perfect, and we don't have to do any of our own work to try and figure out what we should be gleaning from them or not. That's my
Apologetics isn't a very kosher word.
Yeah, I don't think it's a little bit of a straw man. I only think apologetics lasts so long, which is why that Charlotte von Robert piece, I highly recommend checking it out in general. Like the way that she talks about how modern scholars try and deal with Talmudic texts, that they'll like try and explain it all as polemic or either as apologetic, actually is just not taking the text at face value. There has to be another way to deal with morally troubling texts. I think it's really fascinating. I think probably she's the next generation of Talmud academic scholars to be dealing with moral issues in halacha and in Gemara. And I think her approach is interesting and hard for exactly what we were saying. Like it'd be much easier to explain away things easily, but she's saying, no, we have to reckon with the good and the bad, which I think is a more realistic, maybe troubling or like exhausting, but probably.
I loved your Dvar Torah, I must say, but I must also add that I found it completely unnecessary.
I'm glad I convinced you. Wow, I didn't even have to convince you. All right, sorry I wasted your hour.
You didn't waste an hour.
All righty, I think that's everything.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a
Okay.
good class.
Okay,
Thank
thank you very much.
Nice.
Thank you.
Lila Tov, everybody. Shavua Tov. Sophia, be well. Nice to have you. Of course, we look forward to learning with you in the future. Tomorrow morning, of course, my shir on the Siddur at 9:15. We're in the second paragraph of the Shema. We're going to talk about reward and punishment, sort of a heavy topic, but we'll see how that goes. So everybody's welcome. And then all our shir next weekend, as we mentioned, both Rabbi Shulman and Rabbi Helfka will be in Israel on solidarity mission. So they will not be giving their shirim this week. But all I think all the regular shirim, a couple of the series have ended. We'll start new ones, but we'll have our regular shirim. We'll send out all the emails. But thank you very much, and Lila to everybody. Hope to see you soon, and all the best. Okay, bye bye.
Shalom, she was terrific. You were terrific, Sophia.
Have a few Torontonians on. You see the people who extra Torontonians came on, right, Dalia?
Yes, yes. No, she wasn't. Sophia's always great.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. She's
Like me, you probably know her longer than I do.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Sophia. You were terrific.
yeah. I forgot to mention that Sophia represented Canada in Chidon HaTanach a number of years ago. It wasn't, but I figure I can mention that now after the shir. So she comes to her Tanakh knowledge honestly. Okay. And thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go now. This is too many.
I still remember her bat mitzvah drush, which was fantastic.
Oh wow.
Shari Shemaim and Rabbi Diamond's minion. Okay, anyway.
Thank you.
I love you.
Well, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Wonderful talk. Ooh.